Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Madison Street Books. Tonight we are delighted to have a virtual author talk hosting Jeff VanderMeer, Andrew Krivak, and moderated by Beth Golay. Quick introduction of our authors. Jeff has been referred to as the king of weird fiction by the New Yorker magazine. I was very excited to meet someone who's actually been considered the king of weird fiction. So thank you for that. That's kind of like, I feel like I bucket listed something just earlier tonight, like, wow, weird fiction king, I love that. His writing crosses many genres. He is most significantly known for his Southern Reach trilogy. But tonight we are fortunate enough to be focusing on his new YA novel called A Peculiar Peril. And then he will be in conversation with Beth and Andrew. Andrew, the author of The Bear. Andrew has also written several novels. His first novel, imagine being a writer and have your first novel be nominated for the National Book Award. I again feel like bucket list. It also received the Chautauqua Award, the Dayton Award, and his next novel was The Signal Flame, and it also received a Chautauqua Award. He's also written a memoir about a portion of his life in the Jesuit order and being a product of that order. I'm going to rush out and get that. I didn't know that, so I'm interested in that as well. And they will be moderated by Beth Golay, who is the host of the podcast Marginalia, which is the NPR-produced affiliate in Wichita, Kansas at KNUW. And Beth, for those that haven't seen one of our virtual author events before, is also the woman behind the curtain. She is pretty much the individual who makes all of our technology here at Madison Street Books go. So thank you, Beth. Gentlemen, thank you. We're really looking forward to your discussion, and I will circle back when you're all finished. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And in that amount of time, I was able to embed our Facebook Live onto the Mad Street Books homepage. So for those of your friends who do not have Facebook or follow us on Facebook, it is available to watch live at madstreetbooks.com. So Mary mentioned that, Andrew, you have 2 previous novels, and Jeff, you have several. I'm counting the trilogy, Born, The Strange Bird, Dead Astronauts. But your most recent books that we're here for tonight, Andrew, yours is called The Bear, and Jeff's is A Peculiar Peril. And I was going to ask if you could describe the others both, but that's not fair. So I'm hoping that you could take a moment and like give me your elevator speech. Maybe just describe your book for anybody watching who hasn't read it. Short and sweet. Andrew, why don't you go first?
I'll go first. The Bear is it's a novel about the last 2 humans left on Earth at a time when the veil between those humans and nature lives, and it's a coming of age story about a young girl who's raised with her father, and she, throughout the course of the novel, is both journeying to and journeying away from her own, not only her time as a girl into young womanhood, but also recognizing and learning to be the last person on the planet. I mean, without saying much more, that would give too much away. That's essentially what it is. I didn't set out to write a book about human extinction, but there you go.
And A Peculiar Peril is kind of a absurdist epic fantasy misadventure that's meant for, I guess you would say, children of all ages. I was thinking very much of the books that I loved growing up that I can come back to as an adult and find other things in. And the setup is pretty simple and traditional. Jonathan Lambshead discovers basically another world in the basement of his, or a door to another world in the basement of his deceased grandfather's mansion. And he travels to that place and becomes embroiled in all of the things that his grandfather was up to, including being a protector of these doors between worlds, and goes off on kind of a quest pursued by the the emperor of a Germanic Franco kingdom, Aleister Crowley, in transformed form, with the undead head of Napoleon as his military advisor. And it starts out, like I said, like a very traditional kind of fantasy setup. And then it just involves things like giant talking marmots, and Jules Verne strapped into a mechanical machine powered by earthworms, and Kafka's in there and he's amphibious. And I don't know what else to say about it, except it has to probably be experienced to be understood.
Now, when we have these author chats, we usually try to pair authors that either know each other, or their books are similar, or they're friends or whatever. But this is the first time you two have met. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so you were introduced, I think, through email, or at least the idea of a conversation was introduced by Javier Ramirez. And I know you each read each other's books, and I think I understand why Javier put you two together, but why do you think he did?
Well, I'll just take a crack at it. I mean, I would say that The Bear is something that's right up my alley in terms of the environmental themes and everything else. And although Peculiar Peril is only expressing those really through how it reimagines the role of talking animals in fantasy fiction, at least in the first volume, it honestly, I think, in a way, we could be here talking about The Bear and my novel Born, which also has bears in it, for example. We could be here talking about The Bear and Annihilation. We could be here talking about The Bear and the Hummingbird Salamander, my eco thriller next year. So I feel a real affinity with this, even though these two particular books may be probably as different as you can get with novels. I don't know. I don't know. What do you think, Andrew?
Well, I mean, they're different, but at the same time, when I got the email, I went back and read your introduction to the book on fantasy. And right from the start, you and your wife have a line about what fantasy is, and it's that place where there's just an ever so slightly or ever so tangential touch between the human world and some other world. It doesn't have to be a major, science fiction epic like break, but there's just that tangential touch, move away from or stay in touch with. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly right, because I could not help but think about the ways in which what would it take? It would take the last human left on Earth for this, what I call the veil, to lift between the humans and animals and even nature, so that there was a means of communicating between the two. And I thought, yeah, that's it. And yet the other thing too, Jeff, I was really fascinated by, especially in A Peculiar Peril, was the constant search for order in your book, in spite of the chaos and the disorder. And I think, for my part, thinking about the girl and the bear and her own journey is a constant daily, not just this struggle for survival, but a quest for order in some way, just to order her life. So, well, I mean, that's what I.
Yeah, no, and I think that what I see in your book that I really appreciate, that is something that is also in A Peculiar Peril, I hope, which is that I'm constantly searching for ways to convey animal life that are not stereotypical or cliched. And I think that one of the hardest ones is when the animal is actually directly speaking or seeming to speak to a human being, and that can be done so terribly wrong. And what I appreciated in The Bear is just that it is so seamless and it felt so right, because I have such difficulty reading these kinds of books because I usually bounce out of them based on something that I know about the animal in question, or something about my own aesthetic, about how to get beyond the cliche or the stereotype. And it was just so wonderful to be able to read this book and know that I wasn't going to stumble across one of those cliches or stereotypes. So it was such a seamless read for me. It's truly one of my favorite books of all time at this point. So
thank you.
I think it deserves all the awards out there. So
I think a lot about this way in which we, maybe we've, as readers, we think, oh, if there's a communication, it has to be like a direct discourse, but there's, it's let's step back and think about it as the possibility of communication. And on what plane is that happening? What level can it happen? So that, to me, that's where where the cliches where they disappear, and the real possibility of communication occurs.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Mia on Facebook says the bear and strange bird have parallel emotional fields. And as a reminder, if you are watching this and you have a question, go ahead and put it in the comment field on Facebook, and I will bring it into the conversation. So the bear is described as a cautionary tale of human fragility, a stunning tribute to the beauty of nature's dominion, and an elegy. And Jeff, your writing has been described as a non-human world that refuses to yield the foreground, an urgent reminder of how much life we stand to lose. Do you think our world is how the man in the bear describes it, that, you know, everything has its end, or is there beyond?
That's a tough one.
Okay, Jeff, then you go.
I think, at least in my own fiction, and I mean, I can't speak for what Andrew was conveying in The Bear, although I see elements of this. It's just simply that our understanding, we have gotten away from, and in some cases never had, an understanding of the world that we live in. And because animals are kind of like the ambassadors of that world, that they are the embodiment of the habitat, so to speak. And they're also, you know, our neighbors and everything else. At least they are here. And I think they are, Andrew, where you are. We have to see them truly for I would think, just very intrinsic ethical and moral reasons, and learn how to live better amongst our brethren, so to speak. But we also do, it's true, for those who need a causality or practicality, need to do it for our own survival. I think that there's a lot of people who don't really understand the link between the biosphere and our own survival, and even people who support green tech, but would be perfectly fine with a whole forest being cut down for solar panels, and not see the irony of that. So I find this inhabiting of a non-human perspective extremely important, because even though it's impossible to truly do it, and Strange Bird, which you mentioned, I think does have some emotional similarities with the bear, in trying to inhabit another consciousness that's not human. You're inevitably going to fail. Like if I wrote an actual book about a fox, it would be 500 pages of smells, and then you just have to interpret it, because that's how foxes work. You know, it wouldn't actually be it wouldn't be comprehensible to human beings. So I'm doing an approximation when I do that, like Strange Bird, or even when I'm inhabiting. I don't think I actually inhabit any talking animal perspectives in A Peculiar Peril, but I probably will in the second volume. So you're just trying to get an approximation based on the science and the biology and your feel for the particular person that you're conveying. But I do think it's very important. It's not a whimsical exercise. It's extremely important in this world to get this right. What I can say is that, for example, if Andrew's The Bear had a lot of bad cliches and stereotypes about bears, that might actually translate into how an individual person who reads his book interacts with the bear, with very bad consequences for the bear. Let's put it that way. It can actually happen. It's one of those things where you feel like you should get it right, and there are certain topics that lead directly to human action. If you write about snakes in a way that indicates that all snakes are bad, for example, that may well lead to somebody reading your book and killing a snake. I mean, it's just that simple.
One thing, Beth, I was thinking about with respect to this question is it seems to me there's a great deal of hubris from the human side of things, from this whole top down, and a place of storytelling, I decided, is one place where we're especially guilty of that. And I just wondered about, so precisely what Jeff is talking about with respect to, I love this idea of a book about a fox. It'd be 500 pages of smell.
I'd write that, but I do want to still eat, So.
Yeah, right, exactly. I see them outside my window all the time here, but that's right. That shift of perspective, that reframing of the narrative, even in narrative itself. So one thing I was really wanted most of all, like the animals almost secondary, was this idea of storytelling would be the one thing that persists beyond humans, because I don't even think humans have a lock on telling stories. And I think with respect to what persists after, pretty much everything. It's just a question of from what perspective are you willing to, can you see it go, or can you see it persisting in that way?
And I think that it's the storytelling thing you mentioned is so important, because there are literally, I think, structures that support more traditional ways that if you choose them, you're already wrong-footing yourself with regard to this subject. And so what I appreciate about The Bear is that it feels both timeless and classic, but I also felt like it was doing some interesting things beneath the surface with regard to the structure. And that's something I always think about. I think about, am I telling this story in too commercial a way? And I don't mean that in a bad way, but just that some stories are more straightforward than others. But is there something about a traditional beginning, middle, and end even
Yeah,
that
right.
works against, working in this space, if that makes any sense? I don't know if it does. But.
James on Facebook has a question. How much scientific research goes into these books? The blurred line between fiction and legitimate science always has a powerful effect in contemporary science fiction. Andrew, do you want to go first?
Well, for me, it was a lot of books about, how to make a self bow, what you can eat in the woods, what you should not eat in the woods. I remember I was being interviewed by a woman on an eco literature website called Dragonfly. One of the questions was, am I a survivalist? How much research did I have to do? And I'm not a survivalist, but I grew up in a pretty rural part of Pennsylvania, and I did a lot of running around in the woods with my brother when I was a kid, fishing and the like. And it's a pretty short, when you're used to being outside, you could sleep in the snow with a fire at a drop of a hat. Just one night though, not too long. It gets pretty cold out there. It's a short hop from one to the next. And so when you're used to being outside like that, it's not so difficult to pick up the Boyer's Bible and think about, I can imagine working that and making that bow. So for me, the scientific research was about the naturalists, was about doing the natural research, taking it one step toward what it would be like if I were having to eat on a day-to-day basis, and putting my mind in a situation where I was thinking, having my characters think on a day-to-day basis, very much in the present moment. So from a scientific perspective, it was more about keeping things consistent with respect to the time, and not having being careful not to get it wrong in that sense. So I think that was the kind of research I was involved with.
Well, generally in my books, I try to make sure that every aspect of every scene that is the natural world, for example, and hopefully everything else, but not always, is something that I've experienced. It's not secondhand. The texture and the tone of it, it's all something that I've actually experienced. In A Peculiar Peril, it's kind of a little more at one remove, but one reason that it's set in Europe, the alt world, alt Earth of Aurora, this kind of madcap mashup of history, is because we have traveled extensively there, and not the normal tourist things. There was one point where we did a 6-week book tour where editors were taking us to like hidden places in the city and whatnot. So you began to get more of a sense of it. So for example, Prague figures pretty prominently in the book, and will even more so in the second volume, because we know it very well. We know the people there. I know that I have somebody who can check anything that might be wrong about my portrayal. And then also the animals here, it's a little different in that I did a lot of transference. Now you do that with human characters too, right? They're partly maybe someone you know, partly your imagination, maybe something you read, so on and so forth, and then somebody comes to life. But in this particular case, like the giant talking marmots, some of their personalities are based on what I've observed of the raccoons in our yard. So, which have they each have a very distinct personality and way of like looking at the world, at least as far as I can observe. And so there was a certain amount of transference of the animals that I know individually that come through our yard in this ravine, and characters that are in the book. And then there are things that I don't research. And I'll say that in the context where I once, 7 years before I wrote a novel, took a job with Publishers Weekly just reviewing mystery and noir because I knew I was going to write a mystery and noir novel. And I wanted it to just wash all over me. So I do research. But in some cases, if you're layering a lot into a book, it's better to research some of it and not research the rest. And if you get it wrong, just have an expert check it for you, because you can get too embroiled in too many sets of facts.
Yeah.
And then before you know it, you're not actually getting the right like flow in the scene. So sometimes that I know I have someone who can check it, and that's really the best way. So.
That's a great point, Jeff. I'm so glad you said that, because the research question, a lot of people will just, I don't think they ever become writers because they're out there still researching. But I find, I write till I find out what I need, and then I go to if I don't know what it is, go to the expert, go to the book, find somebody, talk to them, live it, do it, try to make it, and then move on to the next thing that you need. And in the meantime, keep writing. Yeah.
Your books are quite different when it comes to pace. So how do you consider pace and time as you write these stories?
I think about pace probably, well, I shouldn't say more than anything, but as much as I think about character and setting. And for my part, I didn't want to write a long book. I have to confess, I haven't read Overstory at all yet. I have it on my bookshelf. I will. I was imagining something along the lines of Dennis Johnson's Train Dreams, where you get the life of this man in a short, essentially in a novella, 50, 60,000 words. And it seemed to me that the part of the girl's coming of age and the man's arc towards his end were what was critical to me, even though the book takes on the entire life of the girl to old woman. And so it was just a matter of being as efficient as possible with respect to what is exactly needed for that arc. And so it just took a lot of writing and rewriting to see that to see that arc through, I think, for me. But it was hard to get it's hard to get a long arc into a short book. So I think that was the great struggle for me, and I hope I succeeded.
Yeah, I think pacing is in a way part of the most important thing, which is to say that until the pacing is right in like the first 10 pages of what I'm writing, like there's a rhythm to it that's correct, I'm not likely to proceed. Now I'm also trying to get the voice of the character and all the other stuff correct as well. But if I don't have that pacing, that sense of what the pacing is, it's difficult, because it's much easier when you're writing and you don't have the sense of what the pace of this book is, or the pace of a particular part of the book, to get the progressions, even just where things should occur, how much space should be left for them. And then that begins to tear at the fabric of the book. And that's where books begin to fall apart, is because they haven't paid enough attention to what the rhythm is and stayed true to it. And that varies for every single book. For me, I don't tend to write the same book structurally or stylistically more than once. And so I spent a lot of time on this issue to make sure. And it goes down even to the technical mechanical thing of testing, where does the scene end? Where does it begin? What happens if I cut this line off the end? What if I cut this off? What if I go further than you would normally go? What does that do for the scene? What does that do for the pacing? And then A Peculiar Peril is very different, because it's like a bunch of benign bombs dropping all over the place in terms of the way it is. So it's intentionally trying to disrupt itself. So the key with it, I thought, was simply that I thought it'd be kind of funny if Jonathan, the main character, instead of being like somebody who's searching for himself, is actually, even though he's a little shy and younger than his age, knows himself and is in that sense mature. So he's kind of like the solid, motionless center around which all of this other craziness occurs. So in a way, sometimes he almost becomes invisible in the narrative, but he's also essential, because without those sections, the madcap whirling of the other bits, the Napoleon's head bits, the talking marmots don't work because it will just float out into the ether and it'll become this whimsical thing. So those are the kinds of things I think about with regard to pacing.
I have a couple of questions that we've received, but I want to stick with this because I have a question about structure. So do you write the book as I read it? Like Andrew's it felt like this linear story, but Jeff's, your chapters oscillate between worlds. So do you write in that order, or were you like writing Jonathan's story and then inserting the bombs?
All right, I guess I'll take this one first. This one I could write non-sequentially, which was really important because the level of the kind of style it is exhausting. So I could only really write like half a chapter or a chapter, every other day. So I had to be inspired and in the moment to do it. There's books where you can get the essence of the scene down and not ruin anything and be able to rewrite later and get the other things in. But with this book, I knew that each chapter had to be more or less complete. So it made sense for me to wake up and do the thing I was most excited about. And then I just simply had to think about the sequencing of what made sense where, which is very different from something like Annihilation, where I feel the process was probably a lot closer to Andrew's on the Bear, which is, this account of the single expedition in a very short novel where you want to kind of live in the moment of it step by step. And so that feels very different structurally. But then structure is often scaffolding, which is to say, when we talk about structure, there's a structure the reader sees, and then there's a structure that the writer needs to write the novel. And those could be totally different things. The structure for the writer could just be scaffolding that allowed them to write the novel, and it falls away at the end. So, I've had novels where I thought the structure was shaped like a starfish, and that was just more or less symbolic of what I was trying to accomplish, that there was one section from which everything else more or less thematically radiated out from. But that wasn't the actual structure of the novel. So it's an interesting question, and a much more interesting question than talking about plot, I think. So.
Yeah, I think for my part, because it was such a short novel, I wrote it sequentially. I will write chunks of a novel, as Jeff said. I do the exact same thing. I'll go and I'll get the bare bones skeleton. You think about building a house, I'll frame it, and then if I can see it's easy enough to put in a little bit of plumbing, I'll take that too, and then go back later and do the finished work, put in the electrical, things like that, so that then the room is done, right? But in the Bear, I just had to keep moving along. I wanted to stick with her, and I knew that it wasn't going to get a great deal out of jumping to the end, writing the end, because there were parts of it where I was that were changing for me and for her and for the man as I wrote along, let's say. And that's actually the first time that's happened for me. I do tend to write more sequentially.
With the pacing and the structure, I was wondering, Jeff, have you heard the audio version of your book?
I have, yes.
And it's narrated by, is it Raphael Corkill?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? I mean, I loved the voices. I love the accents. I think he really pulled off the humor. Were you pleased with it?
Yeah, I take a great deal of care in terms of picking who's going to be for the audiobook, and I thought he was amazing. In fact, I prefer to listen to him read it than me read it, because it really should be read with a British accent, and I no longer have one. So, and when I try one now, it's just absolutely horrifying. But no, I thought it was absolutely dead on brilliant. And sometimes, there's been a great reaction to this book from readers, but a couple of readers, who weren't sure, I said, you should just listen to the first chapters in audiobook, and that will kind of ease you in. And if you have that voice in your head, it'll really help to enjoy and kind of like get into what the book is trying to do. So I thought it was absolutely brilliant. It was one of the best ones that I've heard yet of the ones that have been made of my work. So.
And he was able to do Jonathan's American accent quite well as well.
Yes, no, yeah, pretty brilliant. So.
And now, Andrew, I have not listened to the Bear in audio. Have you?
And nor have I. No.
Okay, then we'll just move on.
Yeah.
But I wanted to talk.
I've,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
I've been asked if I read it, and I said no, and it's a union thing. So.
I wanted to, because the narrator, I mean, both reading it and listening to it, I did both. I was able to just, the humor really it stood out. And, Jeff, you have a way of injecting comedy through absurdities. And Andrew, even though the bear was serious, it is not without its humorous moments. So I was wondering if you could talk to me about the importance of humor in your work.
I'll take that just because there's so little humor, but I did purposely try to put a few funny parts in there. I mean, it goes back to Shakespeare. It's the knock, knock, knock in Macbeth. You have to have some humor, or everybody will go mad. And so for me, my favorite line, and Beth, I think you found this,
Yeah.
where she wakes up. I mean, her life is literally the universe is turned upside down. And she needs to cook a fish, and the bear gives her a fish, and he has collected everything she needs to make a fire. He's taking care of her, and he tells her to make a fire, and then pauses and says, "Smaller this time." That's all you get. I'm glad you appreciate that.
What about you, Jeff?
Well, it's been there all along. It's just completely turned around in terms of the proportions of Peculiar Peril. So, I personally find, and I know the author isn't supposed to say this, I think Authority is a very funny book, the middle book of the Southern Reach, with the bureaucracy and the fact that the guy keeps walking down corridors and never getting to the meeting that he's supposed to go to. And there's a guy wanting to show him a strange room, and his desk drawer has a dead mouse in it. I mean, these are things that are on an absurdist level of humor, but I think they're humorous. Even the tower tunnel discussions of the expedition in Annihilation are absurd. I mean, they're just, but that's what happens also in serious situations. Like if you actually look at transcripts of people in emergencies, they say awfully absurd, completely illogical things. So it kind of supports the seriousness. Here, I just got to indulge in all the things that usually I only engage in conversation or on Twitter. Actually, I actually do a lot of jokes on Twitter that I'm quite proud of, quite involved jokes involving the ravine and whatnot. But here, there's everything from slapstick comedy to I don't know what else you would call it, but there's a ton of different kinds of humor working, and I was just glad to actually show that off, and hopefully it's appreciated. There's also a lot of allusions to different fantasy books and to a lot of decadent era writers that people who know those things will find hopefully intensely hilarious. All 50 people who know those things.
You do, Jeff. You do get the understated English humor. Spot on.
Well, I grew up with it in Fiji.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious.
Through comic books and stuff, so.
There were some passages I was just really laughing. I'm going to get the audiobook and listen to it just for that.
Okay, so Annabelle on Facebook says, "I'm new to Andrew Krivak's work, but it might also apply to him. How do you pick which birds and plants to describe in particular scenes in your work? Are they usually birds or plants that you've researched or personally encountered?"
So for me, if it were part of the book, I try to have nothing in there that is not going to drive the narrative forward. So if it's a plant, they're going to eat it. If it's an animal, not that they would eat it, but that it has a something to do with the narrative. So that would be, I think that would be it. I mean, to go back to what to plot, what's its role in the action, and so how much of that do I need to introduce into the story, and then go from there with what has to be known or not known about it. So, I mean, I think that's That's to me the answer, as much as I can say, you know. That's how I think about it.
I think one answer is that I'm a big fan of writers understanding that animals, when they're in the backdrop, are still actors more or less in the story, and that they're not just inert objects. So one thing I did in Born, a previous novel, is there's little foxes out in the desert that are in the backdrop of each scene, and if you carefully follow them through the narrative, they're actually playing out their own story in the backdrop and the descriptions of all the scenes. So that's one thing I think of is, if something drops into a scene that's an animal or a plant, I ask myself, is it there just for description? It's still being seen through the character's eyes, so there's some reason that it's there or been noticed. But is there something else that it can do? And then I always do try to pick the thing that I have already seen, that I have actually touched, that I have observed. Very different, of course, for A Peculiar Peril, where I had, again, to transfer things. I do happen to have, but I also, it wouldn't have been possible if I hadn't been in upstate New York for a semester and observed marmots for quite a bit then. So there still has to be that kind of autobiographical thing for me where I have this kind of connection. So I know how something moves and I know how that might drive its personality or whatever else with regard to Peculiar Peril. But I tend to also become fascinated by certain animals and kind of mine them out in terms of amateur kind of biologist way, and then it just kind of comes out in the fiction. So it's already kind of predetermined that animal will eventually show up in something I'm working on.
Annabelle says, I definitely need to reread the Fox cut of Born.
This idea of animals and plants, or I should say non-human actors being protagonists, is something that's really interested me a lot recently. And this notion of the protagonist as the first actor, again, it goes back to this idea of there's too much hubris that surrounds storytelling with respect to humans. Like, what if nature itself were the protagonist, was the first actor? How would that look like? So that's, just put that out there as a question. And I think, Jeff, that's exactly what you're getting at in your answer to that question.
Yeah, and I find it interesting how, like, texts from maybe 30, 40 years ago and even now that don't reflect what we know about animal behavior now and animal behavior science become very different books if you know that information, and become real lost opportunities and really outdated. Even though to a reader who doesn't care about those things or know those things, they won't notice it. But when you begin to notice that, it does really kind of change your perception of fiction and kind of this lost opportunity.
Right.
Okay, Jim on Facebook says, Jeff, I appreciate your loyalty to actual science. Besides research, what science/nature writers do you like to read, along the lines of E.O. Wilson or David Quammen?
Well, both of them, and Ed Yong, and then there's actually a ton of people I follow on Twitter who I really respect, who write various nonfiction pieces, and there's so many I'm not sure I could really remember them right now. But the fact is, it changes for every book too, in terms of what I do research on, and also I would say that I'm not necessarily that science-minded. I just try not to contradict a fact. I may go off into some wild space, like in Dead Astronauts, which is very psychedelic and has prose poetry in it and whatnot. But there are contexts where you're writing something so surreal that science doesn't really come into it. And then there's subjects like physics, where every time I turned around while I was writing The Southern Reach, some new physics thing was being discovered that was absolutely absurd on the face of it. So after a while, I didn't even really worry about whether I was being scientifically accurate or not, because it seemed like actual physics was far weirder than anything I could possibly come up with. So it's kind of interesting to me. Also, the other interesting thing is that there's the science and then there's the scientists. So another thing I do is collect eccentric science books. So I have a book called Penguins from the 60s that looks on the face of it like it's an introduction to penguins, but it's actually one penguin researcher enacting revenge on another penguin researcher whose evolutionary theory of a hind Klaus Burr he doesn't agree with. So there's just all this hatred for this other researcher embedded in the middle of this book. And so I really love nonfiction narratives, even in science, that read like fiction, because they suggest things that you can then transfer into your own novels and whatnot.
What about you, Andrew? Do you have any go-to authors
For
for science, for anything really?
wow, I'll stick with the science question. I've been reading Brian Greene recently, Till the End of Time, for obvious reasons. I love David Quammen. I've been reading David Quammen, wow, since I was in college and picked up my first copy of Outside Magazine. I loved Edward Abbey. Desert Solitaire is a book that I just, if you were to say, pack your bags, that would go in there. And yeah. I'm stuck now thinking about who's on my shelf, on my bookshelf out there in the living room. But that's a fair approach.
Okay, so Jeff, when I received information from your publicist about A Peculiar Peril, the supplemental material read, this alt-world epic shines in the tradition of C.S. Lewis with touches of Lev Grossman's The Magicians. So I'm wondering about inspiration for this book. And, it's not exactly a departure from your work in terms of theme, but the audience is. Why YA? Why young adult?
Well, I had this character in mind in this vast ensemble cast that also includes monsters as viewpoint characters and adults, and Jonathan was the focal point. So it was really a matter of following this character, and I was also interested in exploring some of the contradictions of my childhood growing up in another country, and then coming back to the U.S. And of course, Jonathan is actually born in the UK, goes to Florida, and then comes back to the UK, and how that makes you feel a little bit like a fish out of water. And then also the fact that Jonathan, like myself, was, is really a nature loving person, and kind of knows early on who he is, and his other questions are really, not about that. So it's not, it's not that you choose. I never choose that I'm going to write in a certain mode or genre. It's just whatever the next thing is that's most compelling, I guess, is the answer.
As a follow-up, I kind of want to loop Andrew in. Before Mary mentioned the novels that you wrote, both of you, and The Bear and The Peculiar Peril, you're both writing in these new genres, science fiction and fable, although you don't really like that description, Andrew, I think you told me, and young adult for you, Jeff. And Andrew, do you think you would do this type of genre again? Or would you write something more on the lines of your first two novels?
Well, I see it all as a seamless line of literary fiction. I don't see The Bear as being anything other than a work of literary fiction. And so I'm nearly finished with my novel that goes back to the family from Darden, Pennsylvania. And I've not spoken to anybody about this, so why not say it right now here? So I've actually been thinking about a prequel to The Bear, because of course there's no sequel. But so many people have wondered about, well, like how, what happened? How are they there? What is it? How did the Earth get that way? And it isn't that there's a need to answer that question so much as it's the characters getting to the point at which the man and his wife find themselves having a child in the world that they have come to, both traveled and been born and raised into as well. So I've thought about that. But with respect to the type of novel, to me, it's I don't see it I don't go into a different room mentally to write The Bear as fable, if that's what you want to call it, as I would say into The Signal Flame about the Finich family in fictional Darden, Pennsylvania in 1972. I'm just interested in writing good literary fiction. So that's what I would try to keep doing.
Jeff, you mentioned a follow-up. Is this a trilogy?
It's a failed trilogy because it's actually a quartet. The problem was that when I finished the first book, it ended, and I didn't mean to end on a cliffhanger, but it ended on a cliffhanger that both myself and my editor weren't sure made it a complete book. Like there were certain things resolved, but the actual story arc, even though Jonathan's story continues into volume 2, but the actual story arc was the first 2 novels. So what do you do when your trilogy turns into a quartet and there's this issue of a first book that ends on a cliffhanger, and then you wait a year for the resolution of what you would probably normally think you're going to get in one novel. So that's when we decided to make it into 2 volumes and basically have 2 novels per volume. And that does make sense as to the structure of the books. But it did also mean that the reason that there are book club questions in the middle, such as they are, because they're not very serious, was to give the reader kind of a palate cleanser before they go on. I thought it was kind of important to do that, and it kind of fit the way the book was put together. I mean, the chapter titles are fairly absurd in an old-fashioned 18th century way. And there's hidden text on the title page, and I mean, Ferris, Strauss and Giroux was so kind to actually change their name to their version of the publisher on in Aurora. So there's a lot of things going on like that that kind of played into the idea of doing it more unusually in terms of the 2-volume set.
Okay, just a reminder, if you have questions, go ahead and post them on Facebook and I will ask them. So after visiting with you, Andrew, about your place on the base, at the base of Mount Monadnock, and after reading the recent feature about you, Jeff, in the New York Times, which was published this last December, I was wondering if you could talk to me about your own relationship with nature. How often do you sit and listen? Andrew?
Who goes? I'll go. Yeah, well, I'm not up. I'm in 2 places often. Jaffrey, New Hampshire is where my sense of nature is. I should say where the world is a lot more natural to me up here, and in Boston. When I'm in Jaffrey, I sit and listen every chance I get. I mean, there's often work to do. There's a tree to fell. There's brush to clear. There's work on something. There's always work on something to do. Yeah. But just today, I was sitting in a hammock, just looking up at the sky, listening to the wind in the trees. It was really windy out on a beautiful, nearly humidity-less day. And in that sense of storytelling in the bear and the communication of the animals in nature, I honestly really have, over the last several years, tried to take the time to listen and just listen to what's being communicated. And it's surprising. I mean, I don't have any great insight or anything to tell you that comes out of what I've heard. But I watch too, up here, there's always something surprising me. It's not the Rockies or the Tetons or anything majestic, but I've seen eagles snatch fish out of the lake, mink running back and forth, having a grand old time playing in the water. The foxes, there's always something that's just catches me in a moment, and it catches me because I've stopped and been able to put myself in the composition of place, in this attitude of listening or watching. So it's just the kind of thing where over the years I've gotten better and better at it because I've stopped and listened more and more. And all I can say is that I'll just continue to do that. If I had my druthers, I'd live up here all the time, but I have 3 children and they have school, and my wife and I have work. So there's that. And, but I continue to come up here to get that other, what's the word? Yeah, the natural look into life, to get a chance to stop and listen and look. So.
North Florida is really wild. People don't seem to realize just how much wilderness we have up here, although a lot of people are doing a lot to try to destroy that. We're one of the most biodiverse hotspots in the world at this point, given the destruction of other places, sadly enough. And so I do hike in very remote areas of the Panhandle where you're going down a dirt road and you're on a trail that you just can tell has not been walked for a while. But then I we've lived on this ravine in Tallahassee, which is a really unique situation. At the end of the last ice age, the glaciers came this far down and carved out these little ravines. So it's actually quite hilly to some degree. And what that means is, in addition to having 55% canopy still in Tallahassee, is that the houses that were built around these ravines, you can't build down in them. So you have these troughs of woodland. I mean, we're 10 minutes from the city capitol, and there's a trough of woodland running about 1/8 of a mile behind our house that accommodates a pretty biodiverse thing. You're not going to find deer there except rarely, but you're going to find raccoons and possums and armadillos. And over the last year, 2 years, we've spotted, I think, 112 species of bird coming through the yard, some of them on migration, which is an amazing number for an urban area, basically. And so the relationship is very different than when I'm out hiking, because on the one hand, we've spent a lot of time pulling up invasive plants, and we've planted, I think, 350 native plants and understory trees. But we're also invested in the wildlife and making sure the wildlife in this urban setting wants for nothing. I don't mean feeding raccoons. I mean putting out bird feeders, but also having the plants that they need to live off of. So, tons of different wasps and bees and butterflies and moths, that some of which are fairly rare. But what this means, because we're in an urban area, is that I enjoy it and I listen, but I'm also often, especially during the pandemic when I'm out there every day, I'm kind of listening for the threat that they're listening for as well, because it's not a protected space. So I have to worry about things like neighbors using herbicide and plant accordingly, or, basically find a way to negotiate them not using it, which I've successfully done for all around the house, so that I don't have to worry about bringing bees and wasps to the house to pollinate these plants and having them be poisoned. So, I have to worry if I hear a chainsaw somewhere in the neighborhood, because I don't know where it's coming from, because the ravine echoes so weirdly. So it's like, is this just something that's maintenance, or is someone cutting down all their trees and going to change the way the wind tunnel works during a hurricane in the ravine? So it's something that keeps me on edge sometimes, even as it gives me peace. But it also keeps me extremely engaged in a way that if I was just out in the wilderness, which I would love, I probably wouldn't be. And it probably means that it's been shaping my novels in a more interesting way, because it keeps me in the human world too.
So is this a particularly good time to develop a relationship with nature for, like, those of us, stuck inside but wanting to know how to go and sit and listen? Do you have any suggestions for how one can begin? Andrew?
I mean, I think it's a fantastic time. I should say, when I said there's always a tree to be felled, I should say a dead tree.
No, it wasn't in response to what you said.
I know, but I think it's a great time, and I think it does become a function of habituating yourself to getting outside. I grew up in the woods in Pennsylvania, northeastern Pennsylvania, so. Like I said before, I had always was tromping to the woods. To me, it was just something I did. So living in the city was weird at first. And now coming back to Jaffrey, New Hampshire, I refer to as coming back, because in a way it reminds me so much of growing up in Pennsylvania. But I think, yeah, just stepping outside, I think, is a big first step. Even in Somerville, Massachusetts, there's plenty to see. There's plenty of different varieties of trees, birds in a backyard, all kinds of things. And I think start with a bird book. I don't know, Jeff, you could chime in here too on this. I would say start with a bird book or a tree book or fungi or anything. And so I would think about it in terms of groups, like, okay, how much can I learn about this? And then, what's your next point of interest? What are you interested in next? And see what's around you first. And then pick a vacation when we can, to go somewhere where you would find something that would just really, open up your world.
Well, I have a few tips on my website if you go to the yard section of jeffvandermeer.com, because I get asked the question quite a bit. And I think one thing is that it's really important. I find that I think it's not just information, it's that you want to have a connection to something local. And what I would say, you know, someone from New York City will say, you know, well, how do I connect with nature? And I would say, well, you know, I've walked through New York City a lot, and even the barest tree in winter may have something that you'll be surprised if you really look at it. So I think a lot of it is in urban settings and semi-urban settings to just be aware of that thing, to say, I'm going to focus this day on the plants and animals around me. And I think that's what we're finding during the pandemic, is a lot of people are doing that anyway. Then the other thing that I think is very satisfying is that for very little money, or almost sometimes no money, you can actually make a difference, which is to say, benign neglect, if you have a yard, is a lot better than mowing for things like moths and other insects, you know. So it's actually less cost to you to try to kind of rewild, so to speak, if you want to get involved. And, you know, I've had people send me photos of their apartments in cities where they have a balcony and they have 2 pots of wildflowers, and there are still bees coming to those wildflowers. So it doesn't have to be on a grand scale. You can do a small pocket thing that can actually make a difference. And I think that's something that people are looking for, is they're looking for that connection, and rightly so, because it's very, very important to a sense of well-being, but, you know, for many people, but also very important to the world in general in terms of the outcome facing us right now.
I do have a question from Facebook, but do you have any questions for each other? I mean, you're meeting for the first time. You've both read each other's books.
Talked a little bit before the event, and we got
sorry.
that I think we would ask. I mean, I don't really have a question. I just keep bleating out how much I like this novel.
Okay, well, Annabelle says, I have a question about A Peculiar Peril, if it's not too spoilerly. So you have the right to refuse.
Okay.
How did you approach the chapters written from the perspective from the celestial beasts, Golden Sphere and Ruthless? They're very distinctive and alien in a very cool way, which made me wonder.
Okay, it's a good question. So the Golden Sphere is this thing that Jonathan and Crowley are both trying to capture to have world domination, but the catch is that the Golden Sphere is actually intelligent and doesn't want to be caught. So I had a lot of fun writing this because of research for the Big Book of Modern Fantasy and the Big Book of Classic Fantasy, because if you look at things like Grimm's fairy tales, the internal logic protects what is something that is inherently absurd and shouldn't work, and makes it work. So like Hans my Hedgehog is this Grimm's fairy tale about this guy this hedgehog man who winds up riding a rooster around and living in trees and like herding chickens while up in the trees and meeting with kings and stuff. And it shouldn't make any sense whatsoever, but bit by bit, it inoculates you to the absurdity of what happens next. So with the Golden Sphere, I had that in mind. It's like he has his own internal logic, which is slightly sociopathic, and just let that kind of like take over. And then with the other celestial beast, Ruthless, I just thought it'd be hilarious if the villain employs this monster that he doesn't realize is the juvenile form of this celestial beast, and is going to change in shape and size as it's going on and become more powerful and not be controllable. And I thought it'd be even more hilarious if one of the biological things about it is it has an endless pouch that more or less contains all of these other worlds, and that if you get tossed in the pouch, you basically get brainwashed into being a better person. And so all these people go into the pouch and come back out, and meanwhile Ruthless is doing things like trying to fit in by going to a book club meeting and all this other stuff. And so with Ruthless, it was thinking about how she is trying to fit in, but also cannot ultimately fit into this world. And with the Golden Sphere, it was like, how do you make this sociopathic, intelligent marble interesting? I guess it's a kind of weird book. I don't know.
Okay, well, our hour is up. Any parting shots from you gentlemen?
Not really. No, Jeff, it's great to meet you. Great talking to you. I've really,
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
you're a world of information, and not just in fiction, but in real life, man.
And as I said, we have friends in New Hampshire, so next time we're up there, it'd be great to meet in person. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, let's do that.
Well, thank you both.
All right. Thank you, Beth.
yeah, thank you very much.
Mary?
Thank you, Andrew, author of The Bear, and thank you, Jeff, author of A Peculiar Peril. This was fascinating. I really appreciate it. I appreciate both of your time, and more than that, I really appreciate all the time and effort and thoughtfulness in both of your novels, because they're different, but yet there is a lot of similarity. There's a lot of underlying current that I think draws them together. And so I appreciate that very much, and I'd like to thank you. And this is my moment when I make my public service announcement. Both books are available here. You can get them on our website at madstreetbooks.com. Once again, madstreetbooks.com. Last night I was guilty of calling our website madisonstreetbooks.com on social media more than once. So madstreetbooks.com for both gentlemen's books. They're both terrific reads and can't recommend them both enough. So you know where to get them, here in the store or on the website. And I will take a moment and talk about our next virtual event. We are fortunate enough next week on Tuesday, September 1st, to have Helen Phillips in conversation with Gillian Flynn. And they will be, Gillian will be discussing Helen's novel with her. So Gillian will be talking with Helen. So we are really looking forward to that. And again, that's on Tuesday, September 1st at 7 p.m. And once again, you can get these books at madstreetbooks.com. So thank you, everyone. Remember that we are only able to bring these wonderful events to you by virtue of the fact that you are supporting the store. So we do appreciate it. And once again, gentlemen, and Beth, Media Maven, thank you again. We really, really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, folks. Have a great night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. You too.
Bye-bye.